This is Permissionless Liberty.
Welcome to Permissionless Liberty. I'm Dan Sanchez with Adam Knott. And today we're going to talk about something that was very revealing that the Democratic Socialist mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, said. And it just reminds me of something that Barack Obama said, that a lot of the times politicians will say something that just kind of epitomizes their worldview and how backwards it is, from at least from my perspective. And I remember that Barack Obama said, when he's talking about some thing that private enterprise built, he'd say like, "Oh, you didn't build that, because of government support or whatever." And he also said that government is what we do together, like as in there's no kind of like society and exchange and cooperation except through the medium of government, which is just ridiculous. And now we have a similar telling quote from Mamdani, who said, "We will replace the frigidity of rugged individualism with a warmth of collectivism." So, Adam, is it that simple that collectivism is just warm and individualism is cold?
Yes, warm and fuzzy. It's definitely that. That is great, man, when you brought up the Obama quote, because as soon as you said the word Obama, I thought about that famous line, which was, he said, "You didn't build that." And so every person who has worked for decades to build their business, or to build whatever product they built, or to write an essay, or to construct anything, an artist, anybody who's labored for weeks, months, and years to construct something, knew that was something really profound that he had said. Um, I forgot, what was the other thing you said that he mentioned, because that was important too.
Government is what we do together.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, yeah, that was well, I guess with it let us know. Oh, what I was thinking with that reminded me of is the other thing that Obama did that I thought was just amazing was one time he was giving a tour of the White House, and he was down in a certain room, and he because Obama at first came across as a little bit of a centrist, like a reasonable, you know, that he wasn't going to be like a radical leftist, and he was giving a tour of the White House, and he said, "Here's where Nixon did all his bad things, and here's where John Kennedy did all his good things," or something to that effect. And I thought, wow, a reasonable person would have said, "Here's where Kennedy did all his great things, and here's where Ronald Reagan did all." And they would have shown balance, but he didn't do that. He went directly to Kennedy did great things here, and the other side is Nixon, and they did bad things here. And I thought to myself, I can't get behind that. You just told me that you will not acknowledge anything good that might have happened on somebody that I support, and you'll only get acknowledge something good on your side. It's like, it was just one of those revealing moments. The thing that Mamdani said the other day in his inauguration speech was wonderful, because it captured a distinction that Ayn Rand used to talk about, that she thought was central, and I agree, which is that between individualism and collectivism. But that was the good part. Well, the bad part was that it reminded me that the left is more clear on their end goal than the people on the right side of the aisle. Here's Mamdani espousing collectivism as the ultimate goal of what he's trying to accomplish. And the ultimate goal of collectivism is where the individual can't do anything unless it's cleared, vetted through collective approval. And that ultimately means communism. And when I say communism, it doesn't mean people in, Russia in 1930. It just means the idea that the government is used to make sure that individuals don't do anything outside of the realm of everything they do has to be vetted and granted permission through the government is what it ultimately means. And that's what his goal is. He's showing us that that's the goal. Meanwhile, on the center in American politics, on the center, I would argue that what everybody's goal is some sort of mixed a worldview where the opponent to Mamdani is a view that says, no, that's extreme. What we need is part government and part freedom, which is which is very reasonable on its face. But the problem for me is, and I hope for us as libertarians, is that if you have those are the two forces that are implementing government structures or impacting on politics that we have to live under, then you can just see that if one group here knows where they're going and it's here every single day, and this other group sometimes goes this way and sometimes goes this way, the thing has to go this way if we're not implementing anything to counteract that. So it was kind of frustrating to me to see. So the way I wrote that is that there's ongoing implementation of the leftist worldview. That's Mamdani. That's Elizabeth Warren. That's the mayor of Seattle. That's the politicians in Minnesota right now. They're implementing that leftist worldview. And then there's an ongoing implementation of the mixed worldview, which is everybody else in the United States government, whoever that is, whether it's Trump, whether it's it's that idea that, well, that left is really radical and extreme. So we want to pull it back to 50-50 or some combination that's reasonable of government and freedom, which again it's plausible and it's wonderful on its face. But in our current environment, it's not good for me because that means everything is the tug of war, it's going to keep going in one direction. And that's kind of where we are today. So there's no implementation or ongoing implementation of an individualist worldview. So, for example, who's the politician who got up and said, we are going to replace the restriction of collectivism with the liberation of individualism? Nobody's going to say that. Who would say that? I mean, there's people who
Massey.
Well, okay. And if he had got up and said that, that would have been wonderful. But because he didn't say that, I would start my argument at saying he's part of the 50-50 problem, that he probably thinks Mamdani is extreme, but he probably might be afraid to advocate individualism, thinking that would mean he's advocating something taboo, like selfishness that leads to disregard of others. So what that meant to me when Mamdani said that was that another reminder to me that the left knows where they're going, and that's why they're pulling the whole thing in one direction. And so I see that as a challenge of libertarianism. So that's kind of my first section.
So what do you think of right-wing collectivism, though? Because I'm not so sure if the scheme, the schemata of, like, libertarians pulling one direction and the left pulling another direction, and non-libertarian right-wingers as kind of like being in between, like as if they're kind of like the mushy moderates, because I think there are forms of collectivism that are pretty much associated with the right. So like right-wing, like racial nationalism. I mean, it really depends, because you could call some of the DEI stuff as like left-wing racial nationalism, but identity groups that are like associated with the right, like white people and Christians and other men, other like these demographics that the left seems to be at war on. And and so, there's a lot of pushback which against that war, which is good. But then some on the right take it too far, like where they, just advocate the same thing, but in the opposite direction, where they, um, you know, white supremacism and Christian supremacism, and not having like religious freedom, and not having equality under the law. Um, and we see that we see that in politics today. I mean, some people who justify the recent shootings in Minneapolis, that you know demographic like change in America back towards being like more white and more and more towards certain values and cultures is like imperative. And so they're willing to, you know, break a few eggs to make the right kind of omelet. And so, I think there's the Nolan chart where it's like a cross, and there's two sets of axes, and there is left versus right, but then there's like authoritarian um versus libertarian. And so there are kind of like left libertarians, and there are kind of like right libertarians. And um so what do you think of that Nolan chart type schema?
Well, I really appreciate your first question, which was what about right wing collectivism? And so I think that's an excellent insight. So my answer to that is that number one, um, if I were interested in learning about collectivism, or let's say opposing it, my argument would be that it's better to oppose it in its strongest form or most clearly articulated form, or to understand it in its most articulated form, um, which is articulated by the radical left. Because as you'll notice, for the right wing collectivists, to the extent they're collectivist, haven't said what Mamdani said. So they're motivated by cultural ideals, sometimes in conflict with the idea of collectivism. So that would be my first answer, is that if I can somehow address collectivism in its strongest and most general form, then I feel safe that I can address it in a watered down form that some other group, such as a right wing collectivist, would do, because theirs is going to be more watered down, because the right doesn't stand purely for collectivism, whereas asymptotically the left does. In other words, it's the essence of their politics is that the right mixes collectivism when convenient, let's say, I would argue. And then my second answer to that is that, we've kind of touched on before, even though I will admit that as a libertarian, I think I probably started out with the goal of overcoming, or let's say defeating, collectivism. Okay, let's just be transparent. I have come to accept that that is no longer my goal. So what I see as the problem now is not that collectivists want to collectivize, but that libertarians haven't found a way to liberate. So that if libertarians found a way to liberate, that would go a long way towards solving the problem of collectivists collectivizing. So I see the left as having found ways to implement their collective ideals, such as the legal situation we find ourselves in today. And I mean, for example, the California billionaires tax. I mean, come on, that's just pretty scary what's happening. And that's pure leftist collectivism. It's not a right wing impetus that's making that happen. So anyway, those are my two answers. Number one, if I address collectivism in its purest form, that then any forms of collectivism that I see, I can address those. I feel safe that I can address those second. I don't, by coming hard at collectivism and trying to show how it's damaging, it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to have as my goal eliminating it. I could accept it as a part of human nature and then say, okay, well, then what are my options if that's going to keep happening? And that's what I am doing in my philosophy, which is saying, okay, well, I'm going to take responsibility. So those guys are, in a sense, succeeding. We all want to succeed, and they've chosen a certain side of human nature to pursue. Have I been successful in pursuing my side of human nature, the individualist impulse? And the answer is no. So that's my answer to that. What I did is I went to Grok and I said, hey, Grok, give me a short, succinct definition of collectivism. And Grok hit the nail on the head. And here it is. Collectivism is a political philosophy that prioritizes the interests, needs, and goals of the group, such as society, community, or the state, over those of the individual, often advocating for communal ownership, shared resources, and collective decision-making to achieve social equality and welfare. That's not too bad. So I don't do that. That's not what I want, but that's what the collectivist philosophy is. And then I added, getting a little philosophical, collectivism is an ontological commitment, meaning it's a commitment of conscience that prioritizes the group over the individual. It is effectively a conviction that the collective is more real than the individual. And that's getting pretty philosophical, but it's like saying that, and actually when you study leftism, you can actually see times where they do maintain that the ethereal collective has more ontological reality than the ephemeral individual. In other words, individualism becomes like an anomaly or a something to be kind of almost like an inconvenient annoyance that has to we're trying to get it out of the way. So it's really inverted from the way I see things. But so that was just a simple definition of what collectivism is from the start, and that's what I'm hoping to flesh out as we go along. Anything else, or can I go to the next one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. This is really important. And maybe when I say this, people are going to say, oh yeah, I see that. But collectivism is a social and political worldview that one holds prior to the consideration of any particular social or political issue. A person holding a collectivist outlook will view all social and political issues through this lens, regardless of what issue is being considered. It is an ideological framework for viewing and conceiving social and political values. Now, having said that, then an honest philosopher has to say, well, hey, do I do that? Do I have a lens that when I look out, that's the lens through which I view social and political issues? And the answer is yes, I do that. So, but here's the issue. The tendency is for when I look out through my lens is to think that that's the objective reality. And I forget that the other person is looking at it through a different lens. Or the tendency is to forget, because my lens is so strong. I just think it is the lens. It's not just Adam's lens. I'm looking at it with the objective lens. And Bill over there is looking at, I don't know what he's doing. He has a subjective view. His lens is faulty, or he's not seeing it correctly. But collectivism is akin to my individualism or my libertarianism. It's a way to look at the social event that I have before I turn to the event. I already have that view, and now I see the event and I say, okay, is this event good or bad from the perspective of my lens or way of looking at it? So I think that's lost on the public a lot of times. They think there's one meaning to an event. No, there's not one meaning. There's a meaning according to each lens through which that event is seen. I don't know if that's controversial. To me, it's not controversial, but could be, to the audience or to you, perhaps. So I'm on to D now. Collectivism is a social philosophy that in its essence is comparative. And I think this is very important. And this is corroborated in my life with discussions that I've had or words that I've heard spoken by collectivists. Its primary measuring stick for social and political actions is not whether those actions are good or bad or right or wrong from the perspective of an individualistic moral code. Its primary measuring stick for social and political actions is not whether those actions result in the happiness or unhappiness of any individual person. So those are I've just discussed two distinct moral perspectives. We could say, let's say a religious moral perspective of right and wrong, good or bad, or an individualist moral perspective would be, hey, this doesn't feel good to me. So I don't think this is the way I don't like this social policy we're doing because this is not going to be good for me or my family. That's an individualist moral perspective. Collectivism's primary measuring stick for social and political actions is their effect on the relative material conditions between one group and between one person and another person, or between one group and another group. The ideal of collectivism is that material conditions between individuals and groups should be equalized on an ongoing basis. The asymptotic equalization of all people and all groups is the collectivist moral principle. It is a conviction of faith or of conscience that is held independent of any evidence or observation. It is a social first principle. So I think the mistake that many people make is they look at an event and they think that it's going to be obvious from the event itself what we should all believe about it, whether it's good or bad, right or wrong, that the event itself will provide the evidence that we should all take from it to decide whether, and so therefore we should all agree because we're all going to see the same thing. We're going to see a person with a gun and then the other person's falling down, after they're being shot, or we're going to see a person stabbed, or we're going to see a store being looted, or we're going to see somebody being hit or assaulted. And the totality of what we watch should show everybody who's in good faith what that event meant. But that's not necessarily true, because what could be happening is that depending on what my goal is, what I think is good and bad for society or in social relations, I could view it, that result, that social event in that, using that lens. But my main point here is that collectivism is strongly comparative. It's not, and I'll flesh this out a little bit later, but I'll just leave it at that it's more of a comparative philosophy. So the measuring stick is not an individual-centered morality, but more a comparison. It's an outward looking towards the material conditions. And so it sees things, there's always going to have to be two groups. There's always going to have to be one person versus another person, and we're going to look at their material conditions, or one group and another group. It doesn't have to just be individuals. It could be, if I see one group doing something and one group's doing another thing, I can also compare that. I don't just have to compare two individuals.
Are all collectivist worldviews necessarily egalitarian, though? Because you could conceive of like a non-egalitarian collectivism, and I think that a lot of actual collectivist systems aren't, at least in practice, egalitarianism. Like, I think that a lot of collectivist societies are very are very stratified, and the collectivism plays into that stratification. It's like, okay, well, if you're in this low class, and if you're like the garbage collector or the factory worker, it's like, you can't pursue your selfish individual ends of making more of yourself by starting your own business and trying to get wealthy and trying to, raise your status, because that's not what the collective needs. That's not what the state needs. And so you need to know your place, and then we in the the vanguard of the proletariat, we the administrators, we need to be at a higher level than you permanently without any kind of change. And I mean, you see that a lot. I mean, that's kind of how the Soviet Union was, and pretty much any communist, even no matter any communist society, no matter how egalitarian the rhetoric is, like the reality is always very, very stratified, and you see that in dystopian fiction too, like dystopian collectivist totalitarian regimes. So what do you think of that?
Again, a good point. A very valid point. I think that gets to, then I think what that shows is that I'm arguing for a shift in how we view collectivism as a concept. Because when you said, for example, if we have a collectivist concept that says, well, the best for the collective is to have these certain stratifications, I immediately intuit that to be a moral ideal. Well, we'll have the vanguard, and we'll have the another class, the administrative class, but then below that we'll have the class of equality. And to me, then that becomes inconsistent with collectivism, and it becomes a problem of collectivism. That is, I think, an inherent flaw in collectivism, that you can't maintain it without a hierarchy, or you can't institute it without a hierarchy. And my recollection is, again, you don't have to be a really great historian, but I'm pretty sure that Marx said that eventually that would wither. In other words, he probably knew that his reasoning wasn't going to work. And so he had to say something like, well, this class that's going to brutalize, maybe he didn't think they were going to brutalize, but they ended up brutalizing society, that will wither away. So, of course, that didn't happen and doesn't happen. So I would say that a mixed society that mixes a collective vision, but also still has elements of a moral ideal, is a confused, I would argue is confused, and is not seeing, you can't understand as well if you conceive collectivism that way. I think it inhibits one from understanding collectivism in its pure form. And so I would say that when we view collectivism as consistent with a stratification in society, that's indicative of a different view of collectivism than the one that I'm arguing for. So I'm trying to argue that collectivism is based on a material outlook on society. And the essential decision to be made is, when you look out in society, you see we all observe the material differences. It's obvious in circumstances and in abilities. So if you say that if you accept that and you try to form a society that accommodates that, as I'm arguing now, then you're more on the side of a moral ideal, because you're saying, well, listen, these people aren't as smart, so they shouldn't get paid as much to do mathematics. These people are really smart; they should get paid to do. You're doing moral ideal, by individualistic moral ideal, and that consistent collectivism, as I'm advocating, is the equalization. Now, I'm not going to maintain 100% that I'm 100% certain that I'm right on that, but I'm advocating it as a way to see these norms that we're seeing out in society, as a hopefully useful construct so that when we see people who refuse to agree on what we see as obvious, that there's probably an ideological reason. And I'm trying to capture, well, what is that ideology that you're doing without saying that it's bad or evil or that they're monsters? What are they doing? Because they keep consistently saying that thing that like looting is okay. Why would you keep saying looting is okay or accept it? What are you getting at that makes you accept that? So I'm trying to say, well, looting does help in the overall goal of equalizing material outcomes. So if I sincerely want the equalization of material outcomes, I should be accepting of different methods of having that happen. So to make an omelet, we got to crack a few eggs. What's a few stores being broken into and the stuff being transferred over there where it's sorely needed, I could argue, or that history requires, and therefore looting, which by my individualistic morality is really bad, because if that's my store, I have a philosophy all built up on the fact that that's my store and you shouldn't do that. And they're saying, well, Adam, I don't have that philosophy. I have the philosophy of the equalization of society. So this looting's not so bad a scene from my perspective. And which is a good segue into section E, which says, from a collectivist perspective, social actions that allow or that result in disparities in relative material conditions are morally suspect, regardless of whether those actions are considered good or right from an individualistic moral perspective. Conversely, social actions that from a religious or libertarian ethical perspective are deemed bad or wrong are not necessarily considered bad or wrong from a collectivist perspective if these actions diminish material discrepancies between individuals and groups. This explains the collectivists' acceptance of various forms of criminal activity, theft, looting, fraud, etc., when the crimes are committed by people associated with comparatively low material conditions. This also explains collectivists' discomfort with incarcerating criminals. Collectivism's ideal of equality of material conditions is a primary moral value that sets the standard for all collectivist moral values. So, and again, I'm not going to sit here and claim that that can't be contradicted, or my vision of collectivism can't be seriously contested. I'm just trying to advocate that this could be a very, very effective lens or to view collectivism. I'm ready for F if you don't have anything to say.
Feel free, yeah.
Okay. So what's the essential difference between collectivism and individualism? So now I'm going to make two minor premises that are contestable, but one of them is one could plausibly argue that the highest value of traditional religion is the perfection of the individual soul. That may not be how everybody thinks of religion, but one could argue that as I observe things and I say, well, what do my religious friends do? They seem to spend time on perfecting their moral soul. It's an individualistic pursuit, as I see it. So each individual in that vision is tasked with improving toward the ideal that his or her religion teaches. Similarly, one could plausibly argue that the highest value of libertarian social philosophy is the pursuit of happiness on the part of each individual person. Each individual person is seen as pursuing happiness, that is well-being, in their own unique way. I think that's kind of non-controversial. It doesn't mean that libertarians have to do that. It means that one of the ideals of libertarianism is that I want to construct a society that allows Mark or Jerry or Susan the ability to pursue their own happiness. And they don't have to clear it through me or any group that I form. So they're free to pursue happiness. So both of these worldviews, as I see it, allow or do not explicitly rule out a person pursuing moral improvement or happiness in a more or less isolated or individualistic way. And a great way to visualize that, if you think of a monastery where monks are concentrating and trying to meditating. Now, of course, they can be in a communal setting, but the act itself is, as I see it, is very individualistic. And so how do I feel about that? Well, me as an individualist, I feel great about it. I feel totally okay with that. What's the problem? So people may choose to pursue these moral or ethical ideals individually, largely without regard to other people. For example, I may strive to morally improve myself from what I am today, or I may pursue happiness and try to become a happier person than I am today. So what's really interesting is in this individualistic view, we could conceive that the comparison here is between myself and a future self. So I could ground a philosophy, and in fact, I do ground a political philosophy based on my present self and my future self. So my goal is not primarily comparative, or my political philosophy. Now, as a human being, in full transparency, do I see what other people are doing? Do I compare myself as a human being? Of course I do. But what's my primary aim? Is my primary aim the comparison and an action based on that? Or is my primary aim personal? And those are two different separate philosophies. The individualistic notion of morality is inconsistent with collectivism because collectivism begins with a comparison between people or groups. Collectivism is not primarily concerned with the improvement of the individual social unit, meaning the individual person or individual group, but rather with the comparison of this individual or group with other individuals or groups. So it's at a very fundamental level. This isn't, to me, is not even that controversial because as I go through life and as I counsel people that will listen to me or that are important to me, there's a difference between every day pursuing your own goals or looking and worrying about what other people are doing. And it's really interesting because I follow sports. I followed professional sports my whole adult life. And coaches, when you follow professional sports, coaches are essentially philosophers. And the best coaches are the best philosophers. And the best philosophers in professional sports, the best coaches, almost universally preach that if each individual just improves themselves every day, that the results of the team will be better. So they don't say, well, come to practice today, see what Bill and Jerry are doing, and do what they do. They never say that. They always say, come to practice and improve on what you were yesterday and improve today. So when I say that there's a difference between these two approaches to social philosophy, and when I say that there's political philosophies based on that, it's not just some goofy thing that I just thought of. It's deeply ingrained as, for example, I have a family member that and we've had this come up where you go into a group setting and through the chaos of the group, it upsets your goal. So you have the choice to turn to those things and let it distract you and fight those battles side to side with people aside from you, or to try to focus on what your goal is being there today and try to stay focused on that. You could do either one. Either one is totally plausible. It's totally, if somebody bothers you over here or does something that's wrong, yes, you can devote your energy and try to rectify it. But is that the best path? Or should you try to stay focused on your goal? So every person has to grapple with that. So, and in politics, we have to grapple with the collective approach versus the individualistic approach. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more as we go on. I'll continue and finish this section. In traditional religion or in libertarian social philosophy, the moral perfection of the individual soul or the happiness of the individual person are or may be primary values. So I'm not going to sit here and tell everybody who's practicing religion what they're doing, but I'm saying that as I've observed, and being an individualist myself, that it's certainly possible to have a social philosophy where the perfection of the individual in some way is a primary value, and that the value of equality of material conditions could be secondary. So I see that That's my philosophy. In other words, my philosophy has to do each individual pursues their happiness, and where we all end up, that's kind of secondary. That's a secondary issue. I'm not trying to rectify that and make that equal. I'm trying to maximize everybody's individual happiness. In collectivism, equality of conditions is the primary value. From the point of view of collectivism, individual moral perfection and individual happiness are secondary values. These secondary values are to be sacrificed toward the primary goal of social equality, equality of material conditions. So I think this is very important. This explains the often observed phenomenon of the unhappiness of those who adhere in earnest to a collectivist social philosophy. To me, that's plain as day. If somebody accepts a collectivist philosophy in earnest, it's not going to be coincidence that they're not happy. Why is that? Because the happiness or well-being of the individual person is not the primary aim of collectivism. So it's very simple. That's not the goal of your social philosophy. The primary aim of collectivism is the equalization of material conditions between individuals and groups. So my social philosophy, happiness is an important aim, but the individual person is an important aim. It's a sacred aim, as we discussed last week in the sacred document. It was enshrined in that document. That's why that document was so unbelievable. It enshrined the goal of individual happiness, and I think in its religious aspect, individual moral perfection as individualistic goals of the individual. And collectivism has that in its sights and says, that's what we don't want. That's what we don't want. And they're very clear on that. And I think it's just great that it's very good for us to know that, not necessarily to eradicate collectivism, or though that may be an emotional reaction, but to understand the other side of human nature that we are confronted with when we walk outside our house. So
Yeah, I really agree with what you said about collectivists tending to be unhappy. I think that part of that is when you're a collectivist and you're fixated on, um, the collective good, and you're fixated on like fixing society and fixing other people and making them trying to improve them, then necessarily that's redirecting your attention away from improving yourself. But the thing is that each individual only really has the ability to improve him or herself. And so when you extend like your locus of control beyond yourself, and you're fixated on the improvement of other people, um, that your happiness is contingent on the extent to which you can improve other people, then you're hinging your happiness on something that ultimately you can't control. But if you focus inward and focus on the one thing that you can control, which is yourself, and the one thing that you can improve, which is yourself, then chances are you're going to be a lot more happy. And also, as Leonard Reed said, that's really the way to change the world, because the more you look inward and improve yourself, the more that people look to your example and look to your leadership and emulate you and change themselves as a result. And so that's why, like, the way I put it in one of my articles is that true leadership is modeling, not meddling.
well said. Well said. I agree. So here I'm going to suggest the root of collectivism, And this we're getting a little bit into philosophy, but nothing crazy, but philosophy nonetheless. So now we're getting a little more controversial, where everybody has maybe has pre-existing ideas about how our about human nature. Everybody has some have very strong ideas about it, and some have maybe unclear ideas about it. But I strongly believe that collectivism derives from a certain aspect of human nature. In that sense, I think I would use the word legitimate, not to say that it's to say in the moral sense, but in the sense that it's totally understandable that if I'm a human being and I have certain aspects to myself that aren't just totally ridiculous. I mean, Adam, you have a murder aspect and a loving aspect, and you chose the murder aspect. You're terrible. No, what I mean is there are aspects of myself that don't already include bad things. They're just they just seem to be there, and I choose one path to explore or exemplify. It's that choice is legitimate in the sense that I was presented with these choices, and I chose one area of my human nature to pursue. And I'll try to clarify what I mean by that by saying what I've written here. As I would argue, collectivism derives from a fundamental fact of human nature. And we've discussed this before, but so it will be a little bit familiar to you now after hearing it one or two times. The experiences of the individual consciousness are experienced on a first-hand or direct basis. I experience all of my sensations and my convictions and my values on a first-hand basis. Conversely, from the point of view of the individual consciousness, that's myself, the experiences of other consciousnesses, other people, are experienced secondhand or on an indirect basis. So I experience my own conscious experiences firsthand and directly. The conscious experiences of other people are communicated to me or reported to me, but I do not experience them firsthand or directly. So now that sets up a stage of there's two different things going, that I'm presented with two different things. To me, it's unmistakable that I'm presented with those two different things. This primary fact of human nature sets the stage for potential conflicts of social values and potential conflicts of social actions. My social values or my social actions may conflict with the social values and social actions of other people. And to me, that's universal. It doesn't mean bad people or people. It could be my family, could be my partner, could be my brother, my neighbors, my close friends. But there's two fundamental realities for me. There's my own reality, which is very real, and there's the reality of other people that is I postulate to be there in the same way that mine is, but that I don't actually experience. So then other people tell me, well, Adam, I have those things too. And yeah, I corroborate, Adam, with you that I experience those too, but I myself never experienced them. So that sets up a stage for two different. So therefore, as we go forward, you'll see what I'm trying to argue. The choice between collectivism or individualism is not optional. The choice is forced upon each individual by human nature, by the fact that each individual experiences their own consciousness directly and experiences the consciousness of other people only indirectly. So in any social situation in which the values or actions of the individual are in conflict with values or actions of other people, the individual concerned must either choose to assert his or her individual values or actions or defer to the values or actions of other people. That's just a universal fact of social life. And we experience that every day. So I said, when these values or actions are relatively unimportant to the individual or individuals concerned, the choice whether to assert or to defer is relatively easy and less consequential. So simple example would be, wow, the group all wants to go out and have Chinese food tonight, but I want Mexican food. Oh, that's not that important. I mean, I know what I want. I don't want, Kung Pao chicken tonight. I want a burrito. But the group has expressed they want Chinese food. So, let's go get Chinese food. It's not that important. But when the values or actions are relatively important to the individual or individuals concerned, the choice to defer or to assert is more difficult and more portentous. And I use the example of whether to take the vaccine or refuse the vaccine as an example where, well, Adam, we're all taking the vaccine and we expect you to be taking it. Oh, okay. Well, we got a problem because I have a very strong conviction that I don't want to take that. So I'm going to have to oppose the collective here. So, and as we learn, opposing the collective can sometimes be very, very difficult and very consequential. So that what I've argued there is that the choice whether to be, now somebody says, well, Adam, that's wrong because I just do it on a case-by-case basis. I agree with that, on a case-by-case basis. But my argument would be, okay, well, you go outside, you have your day, we go through things, you decide whether to assert or defer every time that comes up between you and the collective, other people, family members, society at large, politicians, whatever, the legal system. Well, let's just ratchet it up a little, get it more important. Let's just ratchet up the situation that you're facing and get out of the realm of easy decisions that are easy to defer or assert, and get into ones that are more difficult. Let's get into, as I said, the vaccine, or let's get into the tax rate or the billionaire's tax in California, or let's get into any number of things that now become important to the people concerned. And tell me that you're going to do that on a case-by-case basis, maybe. But I can tell you one thing, as it gets more and more important, I'm going to choose more. I'm going to insist that become my choice more and more. The education of my child. So when the values get important, I'm going to assert the pathway that I've chosen based on what I've observed about human nature, that there's two opposed forces. And meanwhile, the other side, if it's collectivist, they're going to double down and assert the choice that they have made, that choice should be deferred to. In other words, the more important it gets, what choice you have made, you will now insist on even more strongly. And so when I lived through the COVID controversies, excuse me, I knew what was going on. At least in my mind, I knew that what was being proposed was that as values get more and more important, there's a political philosophy that says because they are important, that's why they should be collectively decided. I was operating on the exact opposite premise, that the more important it becomes, the more I want to have the right to decide that for myself. I wasn't confused. I knew what was going on, but I was powerless politically, but I wasn't confused. I knew what they were saying and what they wanted. And I knew that day had come with this issue, that they were saying, listen, in the old days, we used to say, here's the medical profession. We tell you the facts and you make a decision, Adam. But we have a new way, now that we have control, we have a new way that we want it to be. And this new way, we have the information and we will tell you the decision. And I was saying to myself, no, we're not going to do that. I'm not ready to do that. I'm not doing that. I'm going to make this decision, not you. And that's what the battle was about. So it was really fascinating to live through that, basically an attempt to communize medical decisions right in front of our face. I mean, it's fascinating because we've all grown up seeing communism as something that happens in third world countries to very poor people. in China and Russia in the 1940s or something like that, or 30s or 50s. That communism is something that happens to ignorant people by ideologically motivated people. And usually, in our view, communism happens in poor countries. But I don't see communism that way. I see it as a principle of operation that you very well could have in a wealthy country, and could be imposed on very intelligent people. And that's what I think we're living through right now, is the attempt to have communism. Of course, we're so creatures of visualization that it's hard for us to shake the idea that communism is associated with all the visuals of mid 20th century communism. I don't see it that way. I see it as a principle of important decisions getting transferred away from the individual and towards the government, so that when Elizabeth Warren was trying to leave only the path of government money open to me and trying to shut down the cryptocurrency industry, and when the Biden administration was trying to shut down my medical decisions, to me, I as a trained libertarian, a proud and trained libertarian, I knew what was going on. I said, wow, communism has come to say hello. So the primary aim of collectivist legislation is to equalize the material conditions of all individuals to the extent possible. Allowing material discrepancies between individuals or groups to persist or expand is fundamentally immoral in collectivist social philosophy. By contrast, the primary aim of individualist-oriented legislation is to allow or encourage individual self-improvement without regard to relative material outcomes between individuals or groups. In this conception, the aim of legislation is to protect individual life and individual liberty so that each individual may pursue happiness, quote unquote, or pursue their chosen moral ideal, that is, pursue an improvement in his or her individual circumstances. In other words, however the individual views what's good for themselves, whether it's a religious moral ideal or their group, or whether it's the libertarian pursuit of happiness. It's an individualist conception, or can be. I'm not saying it has to be. Could be collectivist, but in American history, it's individualist oriented. So that if you build legislation based on either one of those, it'll be two different goals. One will be looking to compare and trying to adjust comparative outcomes, as we all know this is happening. But the individualist philosophy doesn't try to do that. It's because the comparison is between myself, the individual now, and the individual in the future. So one is a comparison between two observations. Bill has 20, Bob has 40. It'd be better if Bill and Bob had 30. And one's based on an observation of how I am now and what I hope to be in the future, which is not yet manifested. So those are two separate approaches. And I identify with the latter, which is the individualist approach, where what excites me is the reality that I can create for myself for tomorrow. That drives me. And Elon Musk is that way. So that's why, whatever his flaws are, whatever his political philosophy shortcomings are, he's not a trained philosopher. He's a trained engineer. He's doing philosophy because he has to protect himself. So when you see a trained engineer or a trained biology like Brett Weinstein, who I watch, they only came to this later after they were attacked. So I don't expect them to be philosophically libertarian at the highest levels. But they're wading their way through it, and they're expressing some libertarian ideals, albeit imperfectly. But I understand I understand Elon Musk 100%, and I understand his flaws in political philosophy as well, because you get to be 40 years old and you've just been working your butt off to try to succeed on an individualist type philosophy. And then you're under attack. Why am I under attack? I haven't done anything wrong. I thought I was a model citizen. What's going on? he wasn't trained to he hasn't been steeped in the training of collectivism and how that works. So to him, it's like a shock. To me, it's not a shock. It does hurt and it's scary, but it's not a shock. It's totally understandable. I'm getting close to the end here, folks. So thanks for everybody for sticking with me. This is a really interesting one. This is the one I added today. I told you guys earlier in the email and that's collectivism's impact on the individual person. And one of my earlier heroes in life, Ayn Rand, in her writings, coined a phrase, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, but she coined the phrase "hatred of the good for being the good." As a libertarian, you kind of understand what that means, and I understood it even when I was reading it when I was in my 20s. And then today I went to Grok and I said, Grok, just tell me a little bit about Ayn Rand's phrase, hatred of the good for being the good. Tell me what you can about it. So here's what Grok said, which is pretty amazing. Rand viewed this hatred as anti-human and characteristic of collectivist or altruistic ideologies, which she argued are motivated by disdain for individual ability and reason. In broader terms, it's a psychological mechanism that fuels movements or attitudes aimed at leveling society by punishing excellence rather than celebrating it. Amazing.
Yeah, that also speaks to how a belief in collectivism can make you miserable, because you see that in a lot of like what pervades socialism and a lot of identity politics is just this pervasive resentment and people like Ludwig von Mises like characterized this as a psychological hangup that underlies a lot of socialism, is this dissatisfaction with one's own life and one's own performance in life. And so then it's like a coping mechanism, because the last thing they want to do is reflect on how they wrought that outcome, like their own failings. And so instead, they fixate on blaming other people. And the thing is that like when you blame the successful, just as much as you're denying the role of your own vices in your state, lowly state of affairs, you can't acknowledge the role of other people's virtues in bringing about their high state of affairs. And so you end up having to look at virtues as vices. You end up having to, as Ayn Rand said, like hate the good for being good, because the alternative is to hate the bad in yourself, and that's that's the healthy alternative, because that's the way to growth, is that kind of repentance. But it's painful, and some people just don't want to endure that pain.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Funny how, again, these ideas I don't think these ideas we're discussing are anything too complex. For example, a friend of mine, I think we're having some little discussion about philosophy, and he said the phrase, "The root of all unhappiness is comparison." And my friend's not a philosopher. He's a good person. He's a moral person, and he's a hard worker. He's not a philosopher. That's just not his interest. But somewhere, somebody had come up with that phrase, and communicated to him, and then he communicated it back to me, which is exactly what we're talking about today. So the root of all unhappiness is comparison. So what I'm saying indirectly here is that there's two approaches. There's the comparative approach, or there's the individualistic improvement from what I am today to what I am tomorrow. But that is a comparison. But what I am tomorrow is undetermined. But when I go out and observe two things, those are two things that I see, and I'm trying to equalize those anyway. To finish from what Ayn Rand was saying, again, it's worth repeating. Oh my goodness, it's amazing. It's a psychological mechanism that fuels movements or attitudes aimed at leveling society by punishing excellence rather than celebrating it. I mean, what a distillation. So, in other words, from a collectivist perspective, those individuals who proceed independent from the wishes of the collective, or those groups who proceed independent from a larger collective of groups. So this applies to groups as well. In other words, if there's a group that wants to separate itself from the other groups, that's susceptible of collectivist analysis as well, as just as such as an individual trying to separate him or herself or act independently. I'm sorry, so let me get back. In other words, from a collectivist perspective, those individuals who proceed independent from the wishes of the collective, or those groups who proceed independent from a larger collective of groups, are deserving of disdain or punishment. From a collectivist perspective, the goodness or badness of one's cause, as seen from a moral or individualistic perspective, is immaterial. The crime or the moral transgression is in the act's independence itself, irrespective of its claimed virtue. So that's what I think a lot of people on our side of the political spectrum don't understand, that you may argue that something's good from a certain perspective. I'm moral. Listen, I'm acting morally. I'm raising my family. Every contract I've ever had, I've honored. Check my credit score. I've never lied in a business transaction. You can list all your moral virtues. I'll give you references. I've had friends for 20 and 30, 40 years. They'll all speak well of me. I treat my neighbors really well. I've never attacked anybody on the streets. And in a sense, as hard as it may be for some of us to believe, there's a way of seeing that as immaterial, as beside the point. Because if you, at the same time, allow or enable what is negative, seen as negative from the collectivist perspective, you are already treading on thin ice, regardless of your list of moral virtues that you think that you may. That's a good thing to know, because I think some of us think that when the judgment day comes in front of the collectivists, that we could trot out our moral virtues. And I think in history, when you look at history, that doesn't work. Your moral in front of the collectivist judge, he's going to apply a moral standard of collectivism, not the moral standard of individual virtue. So we need to know that, and not think that somehow that we can argue strenuously enough to shift that tide. No, if somebody's already made that choice that's the lens they're going to be using, then you have to know that by that lens you're not doing good things. You're harming the collective or society or mankind, or my summation then was, because collectivism and individualism are two aspects of human nature deriving from two categories of consciousness, meaning the reality of my own consciousness versus the indirect nature of the consciousness of other people, collectivism and individualism will always be with us. That is, there will always be a philosophical and political manifestation of collectivism, and there will always be a political and philosophical manifestation of individualism. So what does that mean to me? That means that in the long term, this suggests, to me at least, a political conception that accommodates both, at a fundamental level, as opposed to a political conception in which each tries to eliminate the other, which I feel is where we are now. It's totally understandable. In other words, I think we're at the point of human history where the goal is that we both believe we're right. And there, in that sense, it's a what's the word we use today? It's called existential. So we're in an existential battle of two opposed groups. Granted, everybody describes those two groups differently. So I'm arguing from my conception, and it's existential. But my thinking is leading me towards a different conception where taking responsibility and not always viewing it as, oh, well, the problem is collectivists are being collectivists. That is the root of the problem. So what I'm arguing now through learning is that no, they've chosen a certain side of human nature to exemplify, and I disagree with that choice, but it's valid side of human nature that they've chosen to pursue and asymptotically try to implement. But in honesty, my side has not done that, is not doing that. So what would a society look like, as we discussed it before, if collectivists could continue to collectivize, but libertarians were continuing to liberate? What would that look like? Well, I would like to find out what that would look like, because I think it would be pretty exciting, rather than what we have now, which is we're all drifting in one direction. So I would, my ultimate goal right now is that I think if we could generate liberties on the other end of the spectrum, that would be pretty exciting, because aside from the comparison, or aside from what the other two groups are doing, the middle group and the left group, or the collectivist group, it would be really exciting to get up in the morning and have some liberties being generated, and then being able to work on that as an enterprise for us to devote our lives to, or our time, or resources, as opposed to what we're doing now, which is trying to defeat the collectivization of our society. But if we had a positive to pursue rather than a negative to defeat, that would also maybe be in line with our own values, which are production, creation, collaboration, all the libertarian values, and accept the other side of human nature as. But if we had two, now society would be different. It wouldn't be the same. Now maybe we could get back to where you used to have the East and the West, and people were provided with a choice. And wow, that would be pretty exciting. Because in that situation, I feel that the people in the middle, I like my chances with that. Because there's good people in the middle, but they don't have two choices. They only have one choice. Their choice right now is go fight against these bad things that these bad people are doing. They don't have a choice of building anything on the other side. There's no choice. So there's no choice for peace-loving people other than to go conduct a war. So when I see Elon Musk posting, he's posting very hostile things. But what are his choices? Have I presented him with a society to support? No. All he has is a democracy to try to influence the votes, and he's arguing strenuously against the encroaching society that's coming after him to a large degree, whether it was the Biden administration or whether it was Europe coming after him. People like him aren't, the people who are leaving California, there's no libertarian society. They have to go to Florida, and they're going to Florida, Nevada, Texas. But there's no, that in the short term, that's great, but 20, 30, 40, 50 years, that's not a solution. So I'm getting off script now. Now I'm jazz improvising here. So now we're into a jazz solo. Just wanted to let you guys know. So anyway, that's all I have. But what I'm really trying to accomplish is just trying to explain how the other side is seeing things, or how an important aspect of the other, our political adversaries, are seeing things, and why our arguments to them are kind of not effective, because they don't share the same goal as we do. They want a society that's comparative, and we want a society, I think, that's liberative of the individual spirit, the individual creativity, individual happiness, well-being, and that's secondary to collectivism. That's a secondary goal. It's not a primary goal. And so we're on Venus. We're in Venus and Mars. We're talking past each other, and that's not going to change. You can't argue your way out of that. Once somebody's decided one way to go, unless somebody's decided the other way to go, then we've all made our bets. We've all made our fundamental value choices, and then okay, now what are we going to do about that? That a very recognizable group of people have made a certain value choice, and on our side, we've made a certain value choice. So now let's solve that puzzle. It's not working for me very well. So, I mean, I'm doing okay at the moment, but where this cruise ship is going is not a good place. So what can we do? What creative things can we do to enable our values to be implemented while they implement their values? How do we implement our values and get on the scoreboard? Right now we have 0 on the scoreboard. We need to get on the scoreboard. We need to get some points up. Kick a field goal, even if it's just a field goal. Or in baseball, just hit a single. Or even in basketball, just at least one free throw, just 1 point on the board. So that's my goal, is to get a point on the board, or get a field goal, or to hit a single. And if we can do that, then there's hope in my mind. And until we do that, there's less hope in my mind. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Well, like they said, the longest journey begins with a single step. So thank you for your analysis, your sharing your ideas with us, Adam. And thank you, everyone. Tune in next week for Permissionless Liberty.
Thank you, Dan.